Texture. Texture in design, to me, is like that one scene in 2001, A Space Odyssey, where the monolith appears in ancient human history, or ancient monkey time. I'm really excited by it. In design, the monolith is texture. I once tweeted this tweet, but I forgot one thing. I forgot texture. That's like the big three of design. Text, image, texture. Now, texture as a concept of design can have this mysterious, fleeting aura. Everyone's after the perfect texture. You can never have enough texture. And it's that kind of thing that can take a design from okay to great. But I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions about texture, specifically how to use texture. So in this video, I want to cover pretty much the foundation of how to use texture correctly to level up your artworks. And to do that, we're going to need to break it down by the type of texture and blending modes. Let's go. Hey y'all, welcome back to the channel. My name is Duran with DuranSupply.com, here to help you design smarter, not harder. First off, I want to apologize for being a bit more absent than usual. I've been doing some soul searching and traveling. Last month, I was invited to San Francisco by Adobe for a summit on their new app, Photoshop for mobile, which was awesome. I met so many cool people and I loved every second of that trip. So thank you, Adobe. And it's always really cool to be in the Adobe headquarters as a lonely work from home freelancer. Getting to see the office culture and community around there is just really uplifting. I also went snowboarding in Montana about a week ago and I ate all the snow off the mountain. I also paid a visit to Yellowstone, which was beautiful. So that's my life update for y'all. I touched enough grass, so now let's talk about texture. There's been many trends in different kinds of textures over the years. So up front, I just want to list all the main kinds of texture that you'll be dealing with. Number one, paper textures. Not much needs to be said here. Everyone knows it. Everyone loves it. Textures of paper. Number two, scan textures, also a classic. These help your artwork look scanned by a broken scanner or printed by a broken printer. Timeless look. Number three, grain textures. The foundation of all graphic design. Grain. Universally loved, instantly makes anything better. Top tier stuff. Number four, effect textures. These are textures that simulate cool print or just analog effects like halftones, fabric weaving, digital or CRT/VHS screen effects. Good for getting a bit more of an avant-garde or heavy analog look on your design. Now, all of these kinds of textures and the effect that they have on your artwork is dictated mostly by what blending mode you use with them. And by the way, if you want a free sample texture kit, you can go ahead and scroll down to the bottom of my website and sign up for my mailing list, and you'll get access to my freebies, which include a free texture kit. So now let's create a cheat sheet of the most important and relevant blending modes when dealing with texture. And after that, we'll go into practical use cases for all of these kinds of textures, and we're going to refer to the cheat sheet for how to use them best. Blending mode or blending modes. Number one, screen or lighten. I'm lumping these in together because they're very similar and can be used almost interchangeably. Either way, both of these blending modes are lighten blending modes. Meaning what? Meaning it lightens the layers beneath it. So how do you properly use screen or lighten? These blending modes are best used to add texture and hand feel to darker parts of your artwork. For example, if you were to print something and scan it back in, which I actually have an example here, you'll notice that any darker colors on your print are not pure black. They've got speckles and streaks of texture in there from how the ink on the paper reacts to light. So if you wanted to recreate that look digitally, you'd have to find a texture that emulates those darker or black spots of ink and that texture. And you'd set that texture to screen or lighten to infuse all the dark parts of your design with that texture. So something like a dark black paper texture or a scan texture that is on the darker side will usually get that look. So screen and lighten are going to isolate the light parts of your texture and apply that to any darker spots on your artwork. Now moving on to number two, multiply and darken. These are simply just the opposite of lighten and screen. So while the lighten blend modes take the light out of the texture and apply it to the dark, these darken blend modes are going to take the dark parts of your texture and apply it to the light parts of your artwork. Say you find an old book or just a vintage dilapidated print or piece of paper. The white part or the natural state of that paper is now darkened. It's yellow. It's fading. Maybe it's got some stains on it. It's got some texture. Now, if you wanted to recreate that digitally, imagine you had a design with a lighter or a white background, or even just white spots, white text within it. You want to give those lighter spots the feel of that vintage paper, that faded paper. So you'd have to darken those spots with the texture of that vintage paper. And for that, you use the multiply or darken blend modes. And similarly for these, you want to find a texture that is mostly light. Reason for that being is because you're going to darken up the light spots of your artwork, but you don't want to darken them so as to lose any quality of light and contrast that you have in that artwork. You want to keep the light spots light and the dark spots dark. So textures that work best with these dark and blend modes is the obvious vintage paper texture, anything with those spots and speckles and yellow fading of vintage paper. Things like ghosting, I believe it's called, which one of my buddies has a great texture kit on. That's when the ink on the front side of the paper sort of peeks through to the back side and you get sort of those ghosting, fading spots of ink. That's really cool to use these blending modes with. Now finally, we have the contrast blending modes. And for our purposes, the only important ones here are overlay, soft light, and hard light. These are very special and very, very powerful blending modes when texturing, and they're called contrast blending modes. Why? Well, because it's sort of like a combination of the lighten and darken blending modes. So when you set a texture to one of these contrast blending modes, any light parts of that texture is going to lighten up the dark parts of your artwork below it, and any dark parts of that texture is going to darken up the light parts of your artwork below it. So to put that in context and help you understand a little bit better, if you create a layer that's filled with just a neutral 50% gray and you set that layer to overlay, anything below that layer won't get affected. So 50% gray is the neutral middle point of overlay. Any values that go brighter than that 50% gray is going to brighten whatever's below it, and any values on that blending layer that go darker than 50% gray is going to darken whatever's below it. So if for light and blend modes you want to choose a mostly darker texture, and for darken blend modes you want to choose a mostly lighter texture, now with the contrast blending modes, which is essentially a combination of those two, what kind of texture do you think we should use? It's going to be a more neutral lit texture, so not too dark, not too light. You might be asking, if I just showed you that using a neutral 50% gray layer set to overlay pretty much does nothing to the layers beneath it, why would you want a neutrally lit texture? Well, that 50% gray layer is 50% gray on every single pixel. Your texture, your neutral lit texture that from a distance looks like 50% gray is not 50% gray on every pixel. There should be a ton of little specks of sort of dark and light spread throughout that texture in either a randomized pattern or just a pattern. Something like halftones or noise becomes very, very powerful with these contrast blending modes. So powerful actually that I'm recommending that every time you texture an artwork, you should be using overlay or hard light or soft light somewhere on a texture in your texture stack every single time. In fact, in just a second here, I'm going to show you the exact sort of texture stack or texture system I use to texture my artworks every single time. And it includes everything I just mentioned. So the best use case for overlay or hard light or soft light, these contrast blending modes, is to sort of ingrain your artwork with a certain hand feel or surface imperfection. This is all going to make a lot more sense in just a little bit when I hop into Photoshop and show you. Now, there are a ton of blending modes that you can use for texturing that I'm not going to mention here. So these are just top of the list, things you really got to know. But if you want a video that focuses more on those niche blending modes, let me know down in the comments below. Okay, so now that we have a fundamental understanding of what textures we have at our disposal and what blending modes to use with them, we're going to check out some examples to put this into practice. So hopping into Photoshop here, I have a ton of textures and a ton of example posters to use them on. And we're going to go one by one on these textures and figure out what to do with them. I'm going to give you some tips along the way. I'm going to show you where to find textures. And at the end, I'm going to show you the best, never failing system and stack for texturing your design. Let's go. Okay, so starting with this example poster and this first texture right here, this is simply just a vintage paper texture. It's got that yellow fading. It's got sort of rips on the left side over here, and it's got some sort of ghosting coming in from behind or the other side of the paper. And so since this is a lighter texture, when we refer to our cheat sheet, the lighter textures are supposed to be used with the darken or multiply blend modes. So I'm going to set this texture right here to either darken or multiply. And we can see exactly how that affects our artwork. So sticking to darken here, I'm going to zoom in on this text. This is darkening the bright white text in our artwork. Using darken sort of affects more the absolute brights, like this really bright white text, and then multiply sort of affects all of the values in the poster. So deciding between darken and multiply is simply just a matter of what looks better for your artwork. I like darken here. I'm going to stay with darken. And so this gives us that vintage paper texture in the whites. If we wanted to, we could do Command L on this texture to bring up the levels and even darken it a bit to get more of that vintage paper texture coming through. Similarly with the next texture here, this is more of a darker texture, but it's got that same similar vintage paper vibe. But anyway, we would set this one to either darken or multiply as well. And since it is a little bit darker, it's darkening up our design quite a bit. So if I wanted to, I can go into the levels of this one as well and just lighten that up a little bit. Both of these textures, by the way, are from my assorted paper texture kit available on my website. Let's move on to this next texture here, which is from Black Market. So this is pretty much just a dust and speckles texture. And since it's mostly a dark texture, if we refer to the cheat sheet, these mostly dark textures should be used with the lighten and screen blending modes. So as you can see, setting this to screen isolates all the light parts of that texture, all these speckles and the dust, and sort of overlays it on top of our artwork. And this is a really, really cool look. Next up, we have a few textures from Design Syndrome, which is a great channel over here on YouTube and on Instagram. Great guy, go follow him, makes great stuff. This first texture here is a halftone texture, and you notice it's mostly neutrally lit. It's got these little pattern details and folds within it, but from a distance, it's mostly neutrally lit, almost seems 50% gray. And if you remember correctly, a texture that is mostly neutral is supposed to be set to one of the contrast blending modes. So that would be overlay or soft light or hard light. So I'm gonna set this to either one of those. Basically, we gradually go up in terms of intensity from soft light, which is softer. Overlay is sort of a medium point. If you want to really ingrain the texture, you go for hard light. For the specific texture, I think overlay works best. And if I zoom in here, you can see just what that texture is doing. It's ingraining our artwork with this nice halftone texture. But since generally speaking, it's a mostly neutral lit texture, meaning it sort of averages out to 50% gray, it's not darkening or lighting up the entirety of the poster too much. You can see the general light values and contrast of the poster stay relatively the same when we have this on, but we're just adding that minute little pattern and speckles of texture and sort of ingraining it and embedding it within our artwork. Another good use for the contrast blending modes is these sort of folded paper textures. This one's also from Design Syndrome. If I set this to overlay, we sort of get that paper fold coming in. It's sort of darkening up the design a little bit, but we can easily fix that with Command L to bring up the levels and just bringing up the midpoint way a little bit. And so here's a little tip or trick for you. You may remember that I said every time you texture an artwork, you should be using one of the contrast blending modes, but not all textures are made for that blending mode. For example, this one, also from Design Syndrome, is a bit too dark. If I were to set this to overlay, it darkens up our poster quite a bit, and we don't want that. We want to ingrain just the raw texture of it into our artwork without lightening or darkening up our artwork as a whole. So one thing you can do when a texture is either too dark or too light, I'll set this back to normal to show you, is you open up the levels panel, and to get this to a very even sort of neutral gray, you want to bring the mid-tone slider of that levels to the midpoint of this sort of Gaussian distribution here. So wherever this sort of Gaussian curve is, you want to bring this midpoint slider to the middle of that. And you'll see that'll make our texture mostly 50% gray. Now, once we press OK on that and I set this to overlay, you can see that we're just now ingraining the texture of that into our artwork. We're not changing the contrast of our design. We're just getting that raw texture coming through. If I turn the levels off, you can see exactly what that levels did. So lighting is very important when you're using the contrast blending modes. This texture up here is part of my broken color texture kit, and these are the textures that I use every time I'm texturing a design. Why? Well, not only do they have the really nice raw sort of noisy texture that you want when you're using a contrast blending mode, they also have a bit of a sort of color glitch going on, which is why I call them the broken color textures. So if I were to set this to overlay or soft light, I like using soft light specifically for these textures and maybe cranking the opacity down a bit. Now, not only are we ingraining our artwork with this super nice texture, this one's got a bit of a halftone feel to it, but we're also getting that sort of broken color coming through, and it's kind of emulating a bad print, and it's just a really nice overall effect. So I use these textures every time I'm texturing an artwork. They're extremely powerful. The kit is available on my site if you want to go pick that up. Same thing with this one up here. There's a ton of textures in that kit. These are just two of my favorites. I'll set this one to soft light as well and just turn that opacity down. You can see just how much it sort of ingrains this poster with that printed look. These are specifically just very powerful with the contrast blending modes. A little extra tip if you are using these textures is you can open up the hue and saturation sliders by doing Command U on your keyboard and just mess around with the hue. And this is just going to alter the sort of broken color look. So bringing the hue over here kind of made this a little redder, which I like better. If I turn that preview off, you can see this is where we were at before, and just messing with the hue brought us to this point, which I really like. So that's another quick tip for you. I got a few more coming your way. Let's move on to this texture right here. This texture, you probably noticed, is very neutrally lit, but we do have those little specks of noise and grain sort of clustered throughout this texture. So when we set this to a contrast blending mode, it's going to really nicely affect the layer beneath it. So if I set this to overlay and I zoom in here, you can see just how much this affects our poster. I mean, just turning this on and off, you can see just a massive difference in texture. And that is why I say you definitely, every time you texture something, should have a texture set to a contrast blending mode like overlay, soft light, or hard light. And that texture should follow the guidelines that we just went over for the contrast blending modes. This texture in specific is from my printer noise texture kit, which is actually a texture kit sort of fully devoted to the contrast blending modes. I'll show you a quick peek of that right here. We have more than 100 textures that are pretty neutrally lit, and all have their sort of unique grainy characteristics. There's some ones with more of a halftone feel, some with more of a noise feel. So just wanted to show you that. I have a few in the layers panel right now that I'm gonna go over. But before I get there, let's check out this texture up here, which is a scanner texture. Absolute classic. And you already know what to do with this one. We're setting it to either lighten or screen. This one in specific, I think screen looks really good, so I'm gonna keep it there, but I do think it's a little bit too light. So we can open up the levels panel here with Command L and just drag the midtone slider a bit to the right to make it darker, and that definitely looks better. I'm gonna press OK on that. But say I wanted to get rid of these sort of colorful spots, I would do Command U on my keyboard, and that's gonna bring up the hue and saturation panel again, and we could just drag the saturation of this texture all the way down, or maybe almost all the way down, and that looks pretty good to me. So now we're just getting that raw texture coming through. Since we set it to screen, it's affecting all these sort of darker parts of our poster, and it's looking really good. It's looking like we just printed and scanned this. Similarly with this texture up here, this is also a scanner texture. I'm gonna set this one to lighten instead. You can see that this more so affects the sort of absolute blacks, the absolute darks of our poster. It's not bleeding too much into the midtones like screen does. So this is also a great look. And again, this is just something you have to experiment with when you're texturing, whether you want to use lighten or screen. So these kind of textures look especially good on posters where there's a black background. So something like this poster, it looks like you printed and scanned it, or even on posters where it's mostly a white background, but maybe you have black text, and you get this nice sort of printed detail coming through on that text, or really anywhere that there's black or darker values. Let's go back up here to the other textures I have outlined. So now we're going back to sort of the more neutral lit textures for the contrast blending modes. I do think these are sort of the most important part. Both of these are some of the textures from my printer noise texture kit. So as you can see, we have this one, which is more of a halftone feel if you really zoom in, and we have this one, which is sort of a scanner feel. And specifically for these, I like using hard light. And you can see exactly why, because it really ingrains that texture into all of the values of the poster. If I set this just to overlay, you can see we're not really touching the whites too much, and the darks really don't get lifted too much. But when we set this to hard light, which is essentially overlay times 10, it is now perfectly darkening those whites, perfectly lighting up the dark parts of the poster. But again, since it is a mostly neutral texture, we're not changing the contrast of the original poster too much. We're just ingraining this texture into it. Same thing with the halftone looking one down here. I'm gonna set that to hard light. This one's a little harsh, but we can always change the opacity or mess with the levels of all these textures to get just the right look. I'll zoom in here for a bit just to show the beautiful halftone texture of this. I love adding a little halftone texture to all my posters. I think it makes it look printed, just a really cool look. We got an absolutely beautiful paper texture here. This one's mostly darker, so you know what that means. This gets set to either lighten or screen. Specifically, I like lighten for this one. Sort of brings a nice contrast to the dark versus the light parts of the poster. And on top of this, I have some more experimental stuff. So I have this screen/glass texture from Texture Labs, which is a great resource for textures, by the way. Great guide, definitely go check them out. So yeah, this is sort of an RGB screen texture, and you might be wondering, what the hell do you set this to? Well, from a distance, it might appear to just green, but if we were to desaturate this entirely, we can see this is mostly a neutral lit texture. It's sort of approaching that 50% gray area. And so this is something we want to set to overlay or soft light, one of the contrast blending modes. So I'm gonna go and set this to overlay or soft light here. I think soft light gets a little softer of an effect. And I'm gonna zoom in here to get those nice gritty details. That's just gorgeous. I love how that looks. I really love using screen textures with these contrast blending modes. You sort of get that obviously digital look sort of ingrained into the design. Really, really cool look for sci-fi stuff especially. You can even set this to something like hard light if you really want to go hard on that digital look, and maybe it's like a vintage monitor sort of design or something, I don't know. But this is also a really cool look. So definitely experiment with these contrast blending modes for more experimental textures like screen textures, VHS, CRT textures, things like that. Now here's a nice little trick for you in regards to the contrast blending modes. So ideally you want a mostly neutrally lit texture, right? For these blending modes, something that's very close to a 50% gray from a distance, something like this texture. But not all textures are like that, okay? For example, this scan texture right here, this is not close to 50% gray. I'm gonna turn all these adjustments off for a second. Even with the hue all the way down, we do have sort of mostly gray coming through here, but if we were to set this to overlay or soft light or hard light, we do have those really light spots coming through where it's really light and really dark spots coming through where the texture is really dark. And maybe we don't want these super light spots coming through, we just want the raw texture. And we can't really mess with the levels because no matter where we bring this, we're still gonna have that part of the texture that is lighter and that part of the texture that is darker. So what can we do to sort of even out the lighting on this texture? We wanna go up to filter, other, and then high pass. And this is going to even out the light on this texture. If I zoom out in the preview panel here, the lighting is now pretty much fully even on this texture. And we can play with the radius a bit depending on how much detail we want to shine through and where we want that detail. So I'm going to keep the radius maybe, I don't know, something like 90 here. And now that entirely evens out the light across this texture, and we're not getting spots that are too light or spots that are too dark. We're just getting that raw texture coming through and being ingrained into our design. And that's a really neat trick that you can use on pretty much any texture you want. So even a heavy, super saturated texture like this, all we have to do is go up to filter and high pass, and it's going to even out the light on this texture and give us just the fine grained details, which is what we want coming through when we set this to a contrast blending mode like overlay, soft light, or hard light. So this is what it looks like with the high pass. I'm going to turn that off really quick. Massive difference. So really neat trick there. And there you have a few examples of what to do with what kind of textures and some tricks to help you make use out of any texture. Now, here's what I do every time I texture a design. First thing you want to do is make your design a smart object. So I'm going to convert this group to a smart object. And now I want to add some blurs onto this. I'm going to go up to filter. And the first one we're going to do is a box blur at just 1 pixel. It's very subtle effect. Just 1 pixel of a blur. You can see before and after, just to sort of soften all the edges. Press OK. Then we'll go up to filter again, blur, and go to a motion blur. Definitely don't want it like this. We want to change the distance to around 2 or 3. Zoom in really close here so we can see. Let's go with around 3 here. The angle doesn't really matter too much. You can mess with this, but we're really, again, just softening up the edges here. We want some soft edges, especially on this text. So that looks good. Let's press OK. So here's before and after. As you can see, we definitely softened up the edges on that text. Looks a lot better. We can even add some more blur if we want, but I'll come back to that later. Now for the texture, so above your design layer, I have a few textures here that I've selected out. The absolute first texture that you want to bring in here is your lighten texture. So this is going to be the sort of darker texture that you're going to set to lighten or screen. So typically I'll use a scan texture like something from my aged photocopy texture kit, or I'll bring in one of the darker textures from my printer noise texture kit. So really either one works. I'm going to drag that right above my poster and we'll start creating our stack of textures. Let me just see which one looks better here. So let's set this one to screen or lighten. Okay, set that to screen, maybe change the levels down a bit. That looks pretty damn good. Let's try out this one up here. I think this one looks best at lighten. I like how that looks as well. So we can even combine these two. I'm gonna turn that one back on, maybe decrease the opacity a bit. And there we go. Now we have a really good starting point in texture. We're lifting up the darks of our poster a little bit, sort of getting the scan texture involved here, looking good. So the first textures you wanna have in your stack are the lighten textures. You can either just use one or combine like I'm doing here. You don't have to use my textures, by the way, but I do think they're great and that's why I use them almost exclusively. But you can totally get my free texture kit from my site and make do, or you can check out people like Design Syndrome or Texture Lab, who are also great resources for texture. Anyway, now we have that print texture going on in the darks here. Let's add that vintage paper texture going into the lights. So I like this vintage paper texture from my assorted paper texture kit. I use this specific texture pretty much every time. So I'll turn that on here and we're gonna set this to either darken or multiply. I think I like multiply for this one, especially because you can go in with levels, Command L, and just drag this mid-tone slider to the left to get a bit less of an intense effect, but we still get that sort of darkening and yellowing going on all around the white and light parts of our poster. So already this is looking very much like a vintage print. It's got that vintage color embedded in it, especially because of this vintage paper texture. We've also got those scan textures lifting the black. So this is looking great so far. Now finally, to top this off, this is where we add our contrast texture, or the texture that we're going to set to one of the contrast blending modes. So something like overlay, soft light, or hard light. I almost always just use one of my broken color textures from my broken color texture kit. I think it's probably one of the most essential texture kits you gotta have, especially if you're working a lot with imagery like this poster has here. Just the way it affects the image is really nice. Always gives it a nice vintage sort of discolored print effect, which I love. Gives it a lot of life. So I'm gonna drag in one of those broken color textures on top here. We're gonna set the blending mode of this to soft light. You can experiment with overlay and hard light, but I like these textures to be a little bit more subtle. So I'm gonna go with soft light here. Turn the opacity down on this as well. And now with that texture, not only are we getting sort of an overall grainy texture around our poster, but we're also getting those little bleeds of different color spills and just broken colors sort of around the image, which gives it that vintage print look. And this texture does a lot of the heavy lifting too. I mean, Here's with it off and here's with it on. Just absolutely delicious. I think this looks great. If I wanted a bit more of a faded vintage look, I can even turn the levels down on the vintage paper texture here, sort of get that yellowing going even more. And now with all those textures, let's go ahead and put them all in a group. Let's take a look at our poster before and after the textures. So let's just do before the whole poster, before any texture, and here is after all the textures. So let's zoom in here, get some detail shots before any texture, and here's after all the texture. A massive, massive difference. And the blur here really helps to get that texture looking realistic, because if I zoom in here, let's say I turn off that blur, we still have those really hard edges, which is just not accurate to if you were to print something and scan it back in or something like that. You just wouldn't have these harsh edges. They'd be really soft, not only because how, you know, the ink spreads on the paper and the ink bleeds, but also just because printing is not always, you know, down to the pixel accurate. So these blurs really help to make it look realistic. You can opt for a little bit less blur, a little bit more blur, just up to preference. But again, let's look at the before and the after. So this is my just perfect, flawless, I use it every time. It's texture stack for texturing anything, a poster, an image, whatever it may be. I should say this is the system I use because I don't always use these exact textures, obviously, but I always use this system in order. So I have the lighten textures at the bottom, I have the multiplied or darkened textures in the middle, and the contrast, so overlay, soft light, or hard light textures at the top. Now, if you wanted to add any experimental textures or anything like that, I would say add those at the bottom, or if you're doing things like adjustments like levels or gradient maps or whatever it may be, I would also do that below all the texture layers. And we can honestly swap any one of these textures out for a similar texture with the same sort of principle and get an also amazing look, maybe with a different variation. So say I swap this broken color texture out for one of my printer noise textures, which are best to use with contrast blending mode. So I'm gonna set this to hard light here, maybe turn the opacity down, or maybe instead of this vintage paper texture, I want to use this scan texture and have that applied to the whites. So I could just set this to darken and multiply, and I can either go into the levels here to make it lighter so that it doesn't darken up the image too much, or I could just do Command I to invert it, and that's going to get it mostly lighter. Maybe I'll still do some levels on it just to get it a bit brighter. So now we have this affecting the lights instead of that vintage paper texture, and instead of these scan textures down here, maybe I just want to go super simple with a dust and scratches texture from Black Market, bring that all the way down here, set that to screen or lighten, put these all in a separate group, and now we have an entirely different textured look on this poster, sort of following the same guidelines. Looks amazing still. Maybe it's a little too cool, but here's a quick tip if I want to change sort of the color of a texture, especially this multiply texture that's affecting the whites. I'll click on that texture and just do Command B on my keyboard to bring up color balance. And if I want to make this a little warmer, I'll just bring up the yellows to the left and the reds to the right. So now that texture is a little warmer. So this is an entirely different texture stack using the same principle. And here is the first texture stack we did. So just following these guidelines or this system, you can create almost infinite variations of different textured looks on your poster or your design. And it's all going to look good and really complement the design at hand. You can of course go into any of the textures and mess with the opacity and whatnot if you want more of a subtle look. This right here is the stuff, man. Once you have a fundamental understanding of what kind of textures you have and what to use them for and the blend modes to use them with, there's really unlimited possibilities, and that is when you become a texture god. Okay, all right, so that's really it for this video. It went on a lot longer than I expected it to, but as long as you got something out of it, that's okay. I hope this helps you get more out of your textures and to texture your designs better. If you want 15% off my textures, go ahead and use the discount code YouTube15 at checkout. Thank you all for watching. And by the way, I just dropped this really cool new font, the actual first font I've ever dropped, called Jack, on my web store. So go check that out while you're there as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace out.